Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. And for those of you who are joining us here for the first time here at the 8th India Ideas Conclave, brought to you by the India Foundation and WMG Group, a very warm welcome. We would have been delighted to have you join us yesterday as well, but I understand several of you had pressing schedules. And well, thank you for joining us here today. Now, the post lunch, we have three parallel sessions. You are out here in the West End lawns where we will be having a conversation on global capability centers. But parallelly, at this point of time, we have two other sessions as well. Now, one is Education for the Indian Century. Now, that is at the Tamarind Hall. And we also have Cultural Entrepreneurship to Build Brand Bharat. Now, these two sessions are happening in the main central building here at the Taj West End. Out here, global capability in enhancing India's capability for the world. Now, this conversation or this session is going to have two fireside conversations. Those are going to be moderated by Abhishek Goenka, the founder of Eka Advisors. And I'd like to request Abhishek to join us on stage. And our first conversation features the founder and CEO of Answer Source Inc. That is Lalit Ahuja. Mr. Ahuja, if you could kindly request to join us on stage, please. Abhishek, over to you. Could I give you a quick sound check to make sure that you're sounding great? Could you just say something more for me, please? Hold on.
Doesn't seem to be okay.
You
Perfect.
are live.
Okay, awesome.
Mr. Ahuja, if you could have a quick sound check.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I think a little.
Is it, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Much better.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming over to this session. If you think the lunch was sumptuous, this is going to leave you wanting much, much more. I'm very privileged to have with me for the first fireside chat Lalit Ahuja, someone who I've known for a long years and admired a lot. On a lighter note, when I was thinking of how to introduce Lalit, the easiest analogy that came was just like you say, Xerox and photocopying, global capability centers and Lalit, right? So that's as synonymous as Lalit gets with the sector. And another sort of lighter quip in the last half an hour, the number of people who've come and said, we're waiting to hear this session. Lalit, that's all because of you that I got these few minutes of fame. So thank you. But just jumping straight into the chat, Lalit, you've been someone who's seen the growth of what we now call global capability centers from close quarters. You've set up so many, you've been advisors to so many. How would you describe the growth decade after decade if we were to start from the 90s? How would you say the whole sector has evolved and, where has it reached now?
Yeah. So the global capability centers have continued to mature and evolve over the years. Started off with a very simplistic notion of an own service delivery capability. Uh, no different from some of the service providers, but owned by a company for captive purposes. And over the years, with the evolution and maturation of the industry, there's another simplistic notion that is at play now, which is the global capability center is now the enterprise. It is the business. And I don't think there's going to be any further iteration from here on. I think we've reached the summit. And if there was any notion of versioning of global capability centers, and if where we started was, version 1.0, I guess we are at 8.0 today. And what 8.0 really means, a global capability center is the enterprise. You have global leaders, they have functional responsibilities, they influence or own business outcomes. Effectively, the company has now come to India lock, stock, and barrel, in disguise of a global capability center. One thing I want to call out is with this evolution and maturation, um, I guess the concept of global capability center in some ways understates, the power and the potential of what these centers are delivering for their, parent enterprises. I mean, they are the new, they are the tomorrow of these companies. And from that perspective, they represent the future of, businesses and industries and, specific organizations.
No, that's very interesting, Lalit. You talked about companies sort of almost moving lock, stock, barrel now to India. And I think the narrative from being BPO and KPO and IT and ITES is now focused on the word capability. Without names, if I were to ask you of examples where you think there are global companies where the sort of India capability or the India contribution to the global organization is actually greater than the rest of the world, would you have a few examples to give?
Yeah, I would say there's some level of universality around certain capabilities residing out of the global capability centers. For example, if you look at digital, much of digital for traditional, Fortune 500 word, or for that matter, Forbes 2000 is now being driven out of the global capability center. Similarly, if you look at advanced data sciences or, AI, ML, that's another area where we see much of or majority of the human horsepower residing out of these global capability centers. And we're just at the beginning. As we, if you see the next 10 years, more of a crystal ball kind of a prediction, much of some of the futuristic deep tech is going to be residing for the enterprises out of the global capability centers.
So that's interesting. And you talked about, the Fortune 500 and Forbes 2000. But, if you really look at the landscape, it's sort of quite dominated by the larger US companies. We haven't seen the next tier US companies in larger numbers coming in. We haven't seen companies from Europe as much, Japan, Australia. What do you think it will take to convince the next rung of companies or to go wider beyond just the US and give them the confidence and comfort to set up their capability centers in India?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, that bus is already in motion. Global capability centers are now industry location of domicility and size agnostic, right? So you could be located anywhere in the world. You could be from any industry and you could be of any size. So it all started off with the Fortune 100 and went to Fortune 2000, 200, 500 and the Forbes 2000. But the fact remains that there are only 2000 Forbes 2000 companies, right? So from a market perspective, it's literally bottomless and it's now opened out to any company, as small as maybe $50 million in revenues, right? So when you look at a company $50 million and above, you're talking of maybe a million
Yeah.
companies, right? And many of these companies are facing some of the similar challenges as the large enterprises. They're going through a digital a disruption. They're trying to make sense of AI. They are on a journey to cloud. They need access to very different kind of talent to drive their growth and transformation agenda. And for some of the smaller companies, outsourcing is not an option. Sometimes they need people in onesies and twosies, and that is not of interest to the traditional outsourcing industry. And plus, of course, they are building products and IP that cannot go out, the four walls of a company. So from that perspective, we're seeing a lot more coming now from the mid market, from some of the smaller companies, from venture backed startups, from private equity portfolio companies. It's all about speed to market. It's about access to talent that'll give them scale and certainty around growth. So the uh, the ball is in motion, and I'll give you an example. We've done maybe more than 25 such companies in the last 6 months,
Wow.
right? And we're looking at maybe doing a company a week or maybe even more of that size. Similarly, we're seeing a lot happening in Europe. UK is warming up to this whole notion of global capability center. The Asia Pacific is already, very active and live. And Of course, Japan is trying to figure out, some of the cultural and language nuances, but there are significant number of Japanese companies that are already taking the ride, right? So I think the, as I said, the ball is in motion, and this segment, which is the smaller companies and the non-US companies, are going to be the big growth drivers in the times to come.
Absolutely. And that sort of, as you said, the size and scale of those companies is just endless. And, with venture-backed companies continuing to emerge and thrive in the US and elsewhere in the globe, I think if they see one, then they tend to get to the others. And particularly if one venture fund or one PE fund is pushing one of their portfolio companies, it tends to then become a trend.
Yeah, I mean, there's another way of looking at it, which is if you look at the Fortune 500 word over the years, I mean, there's been only so many changes, right? Pretty much it's the same stack and, some ranking movements here and there. But if you look at the new entrants that are coming into the market of a certain size and above, there is obviously uh, maybe more than 20, 25,000 companies, coming into our world
Yeah.
every single year, right? I mean, one of the learnings from COVID was you could even academically have a one-person GCC, right? So, you could be a startup and your first employee could be somewhere in Bangalore, and that could represent your global capability center. And we're seeing something like this happening, and it won't be long before some of them become, Forbes 2000 or, Fortune 500. So
Yeah.
interesting times ahead.
Yeah, and if you have your first employee in Bangalore, it helps your valuation for sure.
Yeah.
And also, I think again, Lalit, I think it's with all the statistics and speed that you're talking about. I think it's also time for five more ANSRs to sprout and lead the bandwagon. Just changing gears a little bit into tax and policy. I think it's always said that perhaps the low touch policy was one of the biggest impetus to this sector. No doubt the STPI scheme and in the early days, the tax holidays were very relevant. But I think if you look at the SCZ scheme, it really fell off at some point and wasn't the catalyst that everyone needed. With this sort of history that we've seen, what do you think are the two or three key policy or tax changes or impetus or improvements you would want to make sure this sort of growth continues?
Yeah. I think a lot remains to be done, from a simplification and from ease of doing business perspective. I guess what has led to the stupendous growth of the industry so far has been this whole notion of, incorporating a company under the automatic route. Essentially, you didn't need any government approvals. You could just come in and file for incorporation, and you were on your own. There were incentive mechanisms, whether it was special economic zone or STPI. I mean, they just helped the cause, but they were not big drivers. The bigger drivers were the fact that it was predictable, it was easy, there was some level of certainty that you could form a company, you could operate, with reasonable amount of control. I guess for the next phase of growth, we have to obviously simplify the regulatory and the tax regime. So one of the conversations we've been having with the government is, maybe even looking at a new form of a legal manifestation. You have private limited company and you have LLP. Why not something .gcc, right? Because it's an extension of an organization. It is not undertaking business. It's a simple platform that enables you to hire people and integrate them with rest of the organization. So from that perspective, you don't need a private limited company and a board that typically tends to become an extra constitutional layer, which has virtually no authority in the context of the broader enterprise. Or even if you look at LLP, I mean, there are, other sort of challenges. We're seeing obviously lots of issues from a transfer pricing perspective. Uh, you know, the GCC as a business model in terms of form and structure, it's fairly fixed, and there is only so much variability. So they can be better safe harbor guidelines, and maybe just the ease of picking up a number and going with it. But we know there is fair amount of litigation, and the advanced pricing, the APA mechanism takes
Forever.
forever, and again there's no predictability around it. So I guess it's kind of a little bit paradoxical that on one hand we're looking at GCCs becoming one of the key pillars for the Viksit Bharat 47 strategy. On the other hand, from a overall regulatory perspective, it's getting more complex, and it's becoming more complex because GCCs are undertaking work which is sophisticated, complex, impactful, and therefore any form of transfer pricing gets challenged by the income tax authorities. So we're seeing fair deal of discontentment in terms of the inaction by the regulators in not simplifying what it would take to bring in more GCCs. I mean, just to give you a sense of what it does to a GCC, it adds months to the entry process. There is a, I would say, 10-15% dropout, sometimes of very high quality companies, because they just cannot deal with the risk, the downstream risk of dealing with either transfer pricing or permanent establishment, where there could be potential taxability of global profits because of the work that is being done by the global capability centers. So think about what I said in the beginning.
Yeah.
The global capability center is the enterprise. It'll influence business, or it'll maybe even manage business. But if this is at the cost of taxability of the global enterprise, this is the end of the game, right? Because a lot of companies would be very hesitant in bringing in work that can potentially, create a risk of, taxation of global profits
Yeah.
from the Indian tax authorities.
So absolutely, Lalit, I can resonate with everything, as a tax advisor. And I would just say the hardest, even when clients ask us, is to put a degree of predictability and computational certainty,
Right.
right? It's just so hard, even if they're willing to take the risk, they want to know what's the dimension of the risk, what's the best case and what's the worst case, and it's just impossible. And I
Yeah.
think not particularly unique to this sector. I think in most situations, we find that it's old age tax rules trying to be applied to new age business models.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think the overall benefit and impact of GCCs on the broader social and economic development has still not sunk in.
Yes.
I mean, think about the fact that the mortality rate of GCCs is extremely low, I mean, less than 1%, and GCCs are forever. If a company establishes a GCC, it would exist for the next 1,000 years, right? I mean, they'll become historical manifestations. So they would have endless contribution to our economy, and therefore it is in our interest under to bring about significant simplification. And we're seeing some level of competition coming in from other far shore and near shore locations, because they are beginning to get a sense of the loopholes that we have in our environment, and consequently
Yeah.
they're taking advantage of it.
So absolutely. And I think as we were speaking earlier, it's not just the direct employment, it's the 10x indirect employment
Hmm.
that everyone needs to keep in mind before trying to go and catch the golden goose.
Right.
And just on jumping again into talent and people, again, I think it's no secret, Lalit, that it was the engineering colleges in the 70s and 80s in Bangalore that made Bangalore become the center of the then tech revolution. But just given the massive scale that you've been speaking about, do you think there's enough talent that India is building to cater to this, which is now a higher end solutioning needed? You talked about the various skills that are coming in. It's not just call centers anymore, and not that call centers are unimportant because they've themselves transformed. But just at a macro level, do you think there's enough talent emphasis at different grassroots levels to create the supply needed?
Yeah. So, I mean, the answer is a no. So, I guess two sides to the coin. We're looking at an extrapolation of where we are as an industry and where we could go. So there's a lot of 2030 data out there, maybe millions of new jobs being created in addition to, I guess, 50 to 70 billion of additional revenues that will come in, let's say, in the next 5 years or so. Uh, and it also means because of some level of linearity of how this industry grows, I mean, there is dependence on talent. You need that kind of talent to be brought into the industry. Uh, GCCs are moving up the value chain. So they're not doing the work they did 10 years back. They are doing more core foundational strategic work, which has which requires talent of three dimensions. You definitely require much higher level of skill sets. So whether it's technology or business, you got to be a lot better. You're potentially powering a large Forbes 2000 enterprise, or even if it is a mid-market or a smaller company, the work that is being undertaken is fairly complex and sophisticated. GCC's talent is enterprise talent, and therefore, there is also a notion of cultural compatibility. You've got to be one of a kind, and there has to be, focus on soft skills development. You've got to communicate effectively. You've got to manage stakeholders, which you don't do, in a services kind of an organization. And many of the talent from a GCC will become future global leaders. We're already seeing a lot of that happening. GCCs are now powering the global leadership pool. The only difference being you don't need to go to the US. The global jobs are right over here, which means you will need to build some level of leadership skills. So therefore, our academic infrastructure needs to step up to bring in some notion of culture and leadership as part of the broader education besides significant upgradation to the curriculum, so we are more AI enabled and more digital friendly in that sense. So there is a gap between the projection of talent required to hit a 110 $120 billion mark by 2030 and the talent that is currently available, because that talent would not do. Uh, the good news is we have 5 years to roll up our sleeves and do something about it.
Oh, excellent. Let me move to two sort of elephants in the room with some of the geopolitical changes that we're seeing, and you know what I'm talking about. Where do you think that narrative will go, and what would that have as an impact on the 2030 target? Let's take the most sort of near-term target that we have.
Yeah. So I think the administration changes are obviously going to be disruptive. So it'll require all of us to be creative in terms of how do we position India to the new manifestation in the White House. Uh, I guess in some ways the bus has already left the station, right? So we know that there are companies that are hugely reliant on their GCCs
Right.
just to keep lights on and to reimagine their tomorrow. Uh, I guess compared to the broader outsourcing industry, GCCs have a slightly better optics. It is about enterprise talent, it is about employees of US corporations, and it is accessing, precious resources that are in scarce supply in the US, right? So I guess it requires a lot of lobbying, it requires a lot of perception management. It cannot be taken for granted. Uh, there is obviously there are promises that have been made during the whole election process that will come in the way uh, in a business as usual manner. So this is where the government and the industry bodies need to step up and be very proactive around, creating a conducive, corridor for continued growth of the industry. I guess anything disruptive is going to slow down, and which is obviously, which would mean some of the numbers are not going to be met. So I guess two parts to the story. One, a lot of water under the bridge. A lot has already happened, so not easy to, reverse the momentum. But at the same time, we'll see friction, we'll see disruption, we'll see some rhetoric, and that'll need to be managed. But it's not difficult because ultimately it's providing access to, the best form of natural resource, which is the human resource, to these American companies.
Yeah, I guess it's trying to stay clear of the noise and staying focused and
Yeah.
let the lobbying partners do their job. But again, just going on the talent part, Lalit, and I know you and I have spoken about this in the past. One of the, for want of a better words, criticism of the whole GCC ecosystem is that we have our own countrymen building world-class products for American companies, right? Whether it's the chip or a solution or anything else, but we still don't have enough innovation coming from India for India, or from India for the rest of the world, right? We're building the best for the global companies, but why aren't we putting the same level of rigor and innovation when it comes to our own product and service companies?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And, like they say, there was then and there's now. Times have changed. We are obviously making a comparison to, let's say, 2 decades back when, we were a more service oriented economy. We had talent that was trained to work in a different way. There wasn't, easy access to risk capital. We did not have proven business or domain capabilities. And in some ways, thanks to GCCs, I mean, we are solving complex technology and business problems for other companies who are themselves beginning to build products, even though some of the products are more for captive purposes. The investment thesis and climate is changing significantly. So, from traditional B2B SaaS, as an example, a lot more capital is now available for, B2C kind of, startups. And we are beginning to see some interesting offshoots. If you look at Freshworks, if you look at Zerodha, if you look at Postman, is a great example. We are beginning to produce world class products. We have the talent, we have the capital, we have the regulatory environment for IP, protection. There is focus on filing patents and on IP creation. And we have the talent pool, right? We have possibly the largest talent pool around AI, ML anywhere in the world, which is going to power the future of what the product landscape is going to look like. So I'm very optimistic about what next 5 years is going to look like. This is a long gestation cycle. This is similar to how the pharmaceutical industry works, right? You got to envision a product. It takes forever to build. The go-to market is a long process, but again, there is great momentum in the market, and I think this is going to be another growth pillar for India, and GCCs will play a big role in producing that talent.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of time to build the tech that delivers our products in 5 minutes. But
Right.
and no discussion, Lalit, can be complete without AI. And I know you just spoke about AI and ML. So is that going to widen and increase the growth of GCCs, or will it cause a sort of temporary slowdown, in your opinion?
So I think a little bit of wait and watch. I think it's AI is still a solution in search of a problem, right? I mean, it's different from anything else we've seen in our lifetime. We know it'll impact everything in a very profound manner, but uh, there is still lack of large scale industrialized implementations or use cases of AI. I think the technology is maturing. There are complex legal issues around, IP and data that you may not know where it is being sort of scrapped from. So, early days, it'll move very rapidly. Uh, we are in touch with majority of the Fortune 500 companies. We know, they have like a third eye almost focused on, everything AI. So I guess um, companies have provision for adequate, financial resources, management commitment. If when the AI wave comes, they will invest big time, but nothing out there that is earth shaking. It'll take away, as we know, routine, commoditize, jobs, customer service is, I guess, another 2, 3 years before it completely goes away. If you look at some part of content creation, it is the next potentially bigger target. A lot of companies are experimenting with even writing code, so it'll impact obviously the huge services industry and the software engineering, that, which is a big part of our overall growth story.
Yeah.
But I guess it's still a while away.
No, great. I don't want to be selfish, being the only one asking questions, so maybe I'm just going to open it up. Yeah, yes, sir. I don't know if there's a mic going around, but
Uh, we have about 3, 4 minutes to keep. I think we
yeah,
managed two
we'll
questions.
take
Yeah.
a few questions. Yeah. Maybe we'll hear you. You can start. I'll just repeat if you don't. Yeah.
Is GCC sort of a reversal of scale? It started as a wave of things moving into India, large IT companies taking over. Now, the same set of customers who gave business to large companies are saying, I set up my own campaign. So it's some sort of a scale reversal.
You heard that, Lalit?
Yeah. So, for some time we saw the pendulum swing from one end to the other. But I guess a very simple way of looking at where it is going to ultimately balance out. There is work that employees do, what is core to an organization, what is foundational, what is strategic, and there is work that you outsource for good reasons. Technology no longer is something that companies outsource, because it is, become more of a foundational function. So there's going to be some level of disruption in terms of what gets outsourced and what stays within the company. It'll impact scales, but not everything that was outsourced will now come into a GCC. I mean, GCCs will continue to keep their focus on what is important for an organization and continue to use the service providers in, you know areas that are not, intrinsically important for an organization.
You had a question.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for the very insightful talk about the GCC. With now OECD pushing for the global minimum tax, and India's matter of time will have to adopt 15% probably would be the tax rate, and neighboring countries being far more cost effective in terms of services, and they're still not under OECD. How do you think would be the roadmap for the next 4 5 years for India, and what do you think should Indian government do to support a more robust growth and sustenance of GCC in India? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think as a country, we've done a good job in moving up the value chain and going beyond the cost arbitrage story. It's not about cost anymore. In fact, it's about the cost of doing business efficiently. So I guess two parts to my answer. As long as we continue to demonstrate the robustness of the GCC industry in terms of the value that can be added to the enterprises, we would never be impacted by some of the cost considerations. We have, impeccable sort of leadership skills, cultural compatibility, much higher level of job related skills and the talent that you can find. And therefore, companies are willing to choose, India over some of the other manifestations, right? So that is one part. The second part is obviously, you know, the impact of, technology in driving, productivity. We spoke about AI. When some of that, starts, creating its impact, it'll, will neutralize some of the cost arbitrage kind of concerns. I mean, we are obviously not the cheapest location anymore, right? And it's an irreversible trend. So we'll have to continue on the path of, adding more value and moving up the value chain.
So your question. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Lalit, first of all, thank you so much for your efforts in attracting all these GCCs to India. I think a lot of us in the room have opportunities today thanks to you. So, when you said you pitch about you're getting one GCC per week in India, right? So, when you talk to these new clients and what is the interest there? Is it Bangalore that is top on the list? Is it Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune? Now, all these are competing for GCC now. So, what is the interest that you're seeing from most of the clients nowadays?
So I think as a country, we've become very segmented by business domain, by specific, talent that is available in certain location. For example, if you're a retailer or a CPG company, you would prefer Bangalore because 80% of retailers happen to be in Bangalore. If you're a tech company, maybe you look at Hyderabad because most of tech is in Hyderabad. If you're in manufacturing or financial services, Pune becomes an option. If you are in ops, Chennai becomes an option, right? So this wasn't the case a few years back, but now, given the deep segmentation and the pockets that have developed, there is obviously a clear location preference based on where you're coming from.
Maybe someone from this side because I can't see any questions. Otherwise, we'll sort of.
I
Have one.
I think we could wind up. We
Yes,
have
we'll.
one more session. So,
Great. Sorry,
Hi.
very quickly. So just a very last question from
Yeah,
me.
sure, sure. My name is Madhva. I head finance for one of the GCCs. My question actually, he spoke on the transfer pricing as well, right? So the biggest issue here is what the GCCs face is there is something called a safe harbor rules, which is fixed, right, by the department. But unfortunately, uh, there is something called where we do the benchmarking as well. But finally, we end up getting notices. I know, like most of
No, I think
people
he
here are the
alluded to
chartered
that
accountants.
it's there's a need for it to get widened and become more sort of truly safe. Right now, you go into the safe harbor and you still face litigation.
Yeah,
So
absolutely, absolutely. So that is also one of the issue, right? How are we going to target this? I mean, so why don't we? I mean, actually speaking, this was more relevant to the finance minister, right? So,
yeah, yeah.
Maybe Abhishek can answer that
Yeah, yeah.
question.
So I think the new direct tax code is probably the answer to that. Lalit, on that note, thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts with so much candor. I know you inspire a lot of confidence for all of us in this room, knowing that the GCCs are going to continue to grow. Thank you so much, Lalit.
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you, Abhishek. We have a small memento for Mr. Ahuja. If I could
Yeah,
request
thank you.
Ashish Chauhan, the founder of Central Square Foundation and who was also the co-founder of Chrysalis Capital, to join us on stage to give away a little memento to Mr. Ahuja. Thank you very much. Please now join me and put your hands together and join me in welcoming on stage Nirupa Shankar, the Joint Managing Director for the Brigade Group, for our fireside conversation. Uh, if we just have the handheld mic, please. ma'am. Could you please give us a quick sound check before we proceed?
Check. Am I audible?
Loud and clear. Over to you.
Thanks, Nirupa. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Nirupa. Thank you for joining me on the second part of this fireside chat on global capabilities, India at the center. Just like I introduced Lalit, you are also, for me, synonymous with real estate. And I would also add that perhaps one of the most understated real estate leaders that we have in the country, not just in Bangalore. I don't think too many people know that Brigade was one of the first companies to go public in an era where it was unheard of real estate companies to go for a listing. And I think you will be with the distinction of doing your second IPO soon. So congratulations and best wishes, Nirupa. But just staying with the theme, and I know Lalit talked about it a lot from a sort of operator perspective. I don't think I would be going too far in saying that if it wasn't for the impetus that a lot of the support sectors in Bangalore and elsewhere came up with, and I think real estate has been critical support infrastructure for the growth of GCCs. And therefore, you've seen it obviously from a different lens, but with as much closeness as perhaps others have. Starting with sort of the COVID era, because I think that was a very tough time for the real estate sector. And I think many believed that this is the end of offshoring, this is the end of people setting up their capability centers. But we all know how wrong that analysis was. Just your sort of thoughts on how you all looked at that. How did you see the narrative changing and where do you see it right now?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the question, Abhishek. Thanks for having me here. So, yeah, I think when we had COVID, I remember doing a lot of panels on people saying office is dead, and a lot of office builders even looking at residential to diversify their asset classes and businesses. But luckily for us, after 1 or 2 years of COVID, a lot of companies soon realized that they do need a physical place to come and work because it was impacting collaboration, it was impacting how much IP was being developed, how much patents were being created. So, very quickly, people realized that, hey, we actually need to come and meet in a space so that IP and more patents could be created. And there was a significant drop in a number of patents as well during that COVID era. Now, of course, after a couple of years, the whole hybrid system started where people started coming 3 days to work. That still sort of exists. But and I think the whole work from home came from a lot of the IT and ITS sector. But credit to the GCCs, a lot of them were doing R&D. And for R&D, you had to be physically present in a lab to actually do work. So the GCC employees were actually back into office almost 5 days a week, mostly because they needed to be physically present in their labs or centers doing collaborative work, and that couldn't be done from home. So even today, I think we see tech parks where there are more GCCs with higher occupancies. We see the places where there are IT services companies working out of. It's still fairly, I would say, hybrid. So as of today, as a real estate builder and as a builder of a lot of office spaces, we build these buildings for the next 4 decades to come, 40, 50 years. So it's not easy to understand where is this market going. So we always talk to our tenants, who a lot of them happen to be GCCs, to understand, hey, how are you thinking about real estate? As of today, what people are saying is, of course, office, there's a huge boom. As you know, the India is going to lease the maximum amount of office space it's ever leased, I think, in 2024. Bank probably about 70 to 75 million of office space is being going to be leased in 2024. With that, say Bangalore is always the highest when it comes to office lease transactions. Prior to COVID, it used to do about 14 to 15 million square feet, but this year, um, it should touch about 17 million odd square feet, which is a very large number. So that just goes to show that a lot more people are taking up more office spaces, especially when it comes to GCCs. As of today, they contribute about $65 billion in revenue. This is only going to go up. As per a recent report, it said 10% per year is the CAGR that we're expecting GCCs to grow at. And if this is the case, then their requirement is slated to be at least 40 to 50 million square feet additional office space. So, yes, maybe 2, 3 years ago, we were wondering what the fate of the office place would be. But I think it's only growing. And we need to be in constant touch with our clients to understand how they're thinking about real estate, because it is it is based on them that we get the confidence to build more.
So that actually leads me to the next question. And I think in the earlier session, Nirupa, there was this question of cities and what each city is known for. But even if you look at some of the examples Lalit gave, no one's yet talking about the tier two cities. Bangalore and Mysore have been waiting in the wings for a long time. We haven't heard of similar cities in other states as well. And obviously, as a builder, you will only follow where the demand comes. So, where do you think this sort of thing is lock jammed? How do we break the growth from being concentrated into only a few cities in India?
It's happening. It's happening surely, slowly but surely. I think some of the tier two cities that are seeing a lot of traction right now are Coimbatore, Trivandrum, a bit of, I would say, Gift City, because of the kind of push that the government is giving. And maybe in the north, like an Indore or, Chandigarh could be some of those cities. So it is seeing a push. We are seeing greater demand. For instance, we like you said, there was not much depth in the tier two markets. It was very like any lease transactions would be based on one or two clients. You can't build for 40 years based on the demand of one or two clients. If that client leaves, then you'll be sort of left high and dry. But we are seeing a lot of depth now in a few tier two markets. So we are looking and considering those markets. I think when it comes to growth of GCCs, it's a little bit of a herd mentality also. If they see one or two, then others also go. And forget tier two cities. You see that in, say, a Bangalore. Currently everybody's in ORR. Everybody wants to be in outer ring road. And as a builder, we are trying to go northwest, like Yeshwanthpur, or we're trying to build closer to the north of Bangalore, which is seeing that. But when I talk to clients, nobody wants to go northwest, even though the infrastructure is already there. You have your metro connectivity, Northwest Bangalore. You have wider roads. There's no water logging. Yet everybody wants to be in outer ring road where the problems exist. So when I keep talking to clients and I say, why can't you move? There is infrastructure waiting for you to come and work out of, and it's more cost effective. I think it's a bit of talent. Everything boils down to, hey, where do I have my talent? An outer ring road, you hold a resume out of your window and you'll get like 10 job offers. So I think everybody wants to be where the talent is. They want to be where it's convenient for people. And but I do think it's a bit of herd mentality. So once you have a few people move to a certain part of the city or into a different tier two or tier three city, you'll find others moving there as well. And it's just a matter of time. I think the next 5 years we'll see a lot of expansion into our tier two cities. um, Another point to add there is, I think that there's a lot of the youth, right? That's the youth is the one driving this whole, driving the workforce. I think average age of our working population is 30 to 35 years old. They need the social infrastructure. They need the restaurants, they need good schools, they need good hospitals. So everything has to go hand in hand. Like if you want, for instance, in Gift City, we operate out of three different states when it comes to your SEZ parks. One in Kochi, one in Bangalore or Karnataka, and one in Gujarat in Gift City. Nobody wants to come to Gift City. The infrastructure is there, the government push and incentives are there. Nobody wants to come there because there's no social infrastructure. So now I think government is looking at adding more bars, restaurants, allowing liquor to be served in that part of the country, because frankly, that is a driving force. I mean, it sounds very simple, but that is a driving force. Even if you don't drink beer, when you go to Gujarat, you have this thirst to drink beer. So it's just a driving force. So we need social infrastructure for the youth of the country.
I was just going to make that point, Nirupa, that talent will move where there is social infrastructure, and I think you talked about Northwest Bangalore and what you all did with Brigade Gateway. I think is revolutionized that whole area. Just staying with this theme, what do you think is stopping people from doing these larger scale, multi asset class developments? I mean, you see large corporate parks coming up, millions of square feet with, a few small restaurants and food courts, but nobody's really investing in building a livable city. I mean, again, since we're all from Bangalore, I think Bhartiya City to some extent is another such example. But why are there such few of these integrated conclaves?
Availability of clean title and land. That's the main driver. If you have clean title and land, we are all ready to build. Brigade has been building large mixed use townships, I think, since 2007 also. We started Brigade Gateway in Malleshwaram. Nobody wanted to come there. When we had World Trade Center, every consultant said, you're mad to build office here. But over time, people have understood, okay, it's a new hub. We are actually looking to build a 75-acre township closer to the airport and with a focus on bringing more GCCs there. And we are thinking, hey, what is the social infrastructure we need to create? And it's somehow left to builders such as ourselves to provide the social infrastructure. And I would say today, when you think about office, the first thing we do is actually look at the social infrastructure. You first lease your gym, you first lease your creche, you figure out how many bars, cafes, and restaurants you can have in the campus, and then you start leasing it to clients. And the focus on food and beverage is becoming a lot more important. The focus on creche is fitness is becoming more important. So taking it to a larger scale, like a mixed-use township, I think all of us, at least we strongly believe that that is the future of our cities. With the kind of infrastructure issues that all of us have, mixed use townships where you can live, work, play is the future of our cities if we want to sort of decongest our cities as well. So again, but you can build that if you have enough area, if you have enough clean, if you can get clean title land parcels. And you need large land parcels. You need 40 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres to do all this. And you generally can't find that in CBD areas. You have to go towards the outskirts of the city where the infrastructure has not yet been built. But if you build the roads first, if you build the metro connectivity first, I don't think people have an issue going 30 kilometers away, 40 kilometers away if the speed of traffic is there. So if you start building the infrastructure first, and then, I understand townships, if you want 100 acres of clean title, then you have to go towards the outskirts of the city. We're all ready to build.
And therefore, is there a particular policy impetus that as a developer you would expect? I know the SEZ scheme had a lot of it. I would venture to say that it hasn't really been a catalyst enough. So for builders to make these massive investments, what is that one policy change, or I don't like the word incentive, but that push that you would need to take some bigger bets and create that infrastructure?
We are not looking for major incentives. Just give us our approvals quickly. We'll work fast. Right now approvals take at least 1 year to get. Then a lot of laws are retrospectively applied in terms of taxation. There's no clarity in terms of a lot of the policies. So if we had some clarity, for instance, TDR or premium FSI, there's no clarity for 7, 8 years. So we're all stuck in limbo. There's a lot of talk of single window clearance. It is not single window clearance anywhere. So we just want approvals and laws to be clear so that we can all follow the laws. We can all follow it knowing well that, hey, this is prescriptively, this is what it is. We want confidence that laws will not retrospectively be enacted and give us our approvals quickly. It is up to us to make our projects uh, profitable or financially sound. But of course, a lot of this, if we are to build social infrastructure like schools or hospitals or anything else, then of course, getting land at a slightly lower cost is always welcome. But apart from that, I don't think builders are looking for anything exceptional.
Yeah, maybe more clarity on credits, on GST credits on buildings and not have the Supreme Court send it back to the High Court. Yeah, so I think some of those.
So that's what I meant by lack of clarity with GST and, like for instance, joint development agreements. We've talked on that before. There's no clarity. We don't know what GST bills we are going to be getting. Sometimes you could be getting GST retrospectively put onto projects that were pre-GST era. So those kind of things I think are demotivating.
Sure. Nirupa, you mentioned about engaging a lot with your occupants, tenants, and determining trends on where they're going to grow, what kind of growth is coming. How much does AI focus in those feature in those conversations, and what is your own sense of the impact that AI will have, and what are you hearing your occupiers say?
No, I think AI is the future. Everybody is using it in some form or fashion. And I think within the next 4 to 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if, it's infiltrated our lives in a very big way. Um, a lot of occupiers are using it in their own business. For instance, with us, I know even as a real estate developer, which is typically a very brick and mortar traditional business, not known to use technology, most builders use only 1% of their top line into tech. Um, but now that's changing, right? Everybody wants to use more of AI. For instance, every department, whether it's your HR, when it comes to recruitment, running through thousands of resumes by using AI. When it comes to legal, using legal tech to go through hundreds of agreements, again, that can use AI. We use a lot of drone technology to scan large parcels of land to understand if there's any nalas, high tension cables, whatever, over large parcels of land. um, and interestingly enough, I never thought this. I thought AI would first disrupt your mundane businesses and mundane activities like accounting, legal, etc. But I find AI actually disrupting the creative jobs first. They're taking, like, whether it comes to creative writing, creative design. I find AI actually interestingly having disrupted that first before the mundane jobs. Maybe there's some sort of more resistance when it comes to lawyers saying, hey, this is how it's always been done. A little bit of resistance when it comes to certain roles. But I think we will all have to use and incorporate AI into our businesses if we are to stay ahead of the curve.
Right. So for the last question again, before I open it up to the rest of the audience, we've always talked about this being the India decade. Real estate is booming, GCCs are booming, everything you touch is turning to gold. But since we're all realists and we've seen enough cycles, what would be those two things that you would call out as potential headwinds?
See, currently the way the market is, there is I only see mostly tailwinds because India is actually seeing decadal highs when it comes to real estate. Usually, with real estate, if residential was doing well, then office and maybe hospitality wouldn't be doing so well. If office and hospitality was doing well, then sometimes residential won't be doing well. This is the first time in a decade where we are seeing the best market, the strongest demand that we have seen in the decade, like I said. Every sector is doing well, whether it's retail, whether it's office, hotels, residential. The only thing we sort of keep track of is, of course, the velocity of bookings, the velocity of sales, the velocity of transactions. But even that, I would say, is very, very strong. You can reduce your sales cycle while increasing price, right? Usually, there's an inverse relationship between price and demand.
Right.
But here, price is increasing and demand is increasing. There are a lot of macroeconomic factors propelling this growth, and I don't see any headwinds today. And I don't think I can talk for the next 10 years. I think that would be unrealistic of me, but I can say for the next 2 to 3 years, we don't see anything from an India centric view. Of course, global macroeconomic issues are always there. But despite the fact that we've had this Russian Ukraine war, Israel Palestinian war, it hasn't impacted India in a very large way. The other thing we track is like interest rates and where are home loans going. That has also increased. I think post COVID, home loans were at 6.5%. It's moved up to 8.5%, but it hasn't impacted demand in any way. Unless maybe home loans touch 9.5%, I don't see sentiments dampening. um, Again, India being India, there's huge urban population, huge acceleration towards urbanization. Currently, 36% of our population lives in our cities. It's going to go up to 40%. That's an addition of another 50 million people into our cities. So I only see growth right now. And as long as there's central government stability, so again, I'm speaking only for the next 3 to 4 years, I don't see any major headwinds at the moment.
Fingers crossed, Nirupa. Thank you.
Touch wood.
I would love to open it up for any questions. Sure. Yes, please.
Yep. Please introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Hi, my name is Lokesh Singhal, and I have a question. Like, looking at the perspective of from Viksit Bharat 2047 and the increasing pressure on our existing cities and the infrastructure, and the government planning to create new cities, from your perspective, being a real estate developer, what's advice or what steps do you think the government should take to implement this faster in a more successful way?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. See, the most important thing for other cities to develop is accessibility, right? Like for instance, Mysore has seen a huge growth impact. I think government has also talked about Mysore being a GCC, new GCC district. I think accessibility is the most important. First, you have to be able to get to it fast from a metro city. And of course, the other things that we spoke about, the social infra, and do they have, like Coimbatore, we talked about being another tier two market that is coming up. That's again because of the number of their 300 plus engineering colleges there. The engineering colleges, social infra now is picking up lots more retail, lots more F&B. So I think apart from social infra, accessibility is the most important thing. I think government has also already said that they're going to invest that 11.11 lakh crores into infrastructure, and their plan to invest into infrastructure is for the next 7 years is double of what it was in the previous 7 years. So we need metro connectivity, smaller airports in the tier two markets, because that all helps real estate and accessibility. Like even North Bangalore, why is it growing now? Only because of the airport and the millions of people. I think 40 million people have come through that airport. So wherever you see large airports, you will see also builders coming along the way, developing their properties, and also because the road connectivity is very good there. But once the metro connectivity starts there, there'll be a different level of growth
Absolutely.
as well.
Super. Thank you, Nirupa. Thank you for all your. Thank you for
Thank
joining
you
us this
so much for
afternoon.
having
Thank you.
me.
Just a moment, Ms. Shankar. We have a small memento for you. To give you a memento, I'd like to welcome on stage Dr. Sham, who is the president of RV Educational Institutions, Karnataka's premier and leading educational institutions. Thank you so much for joining us here, Dr. Sham. Thank you, Dr. Sham. To give a little memento to Abhishek Goenka, I'd like to welcome on stage the India CFO of Adobe, Raghuram Krishnan. Thank you, Raghuram. Thank you, Abhishek. We will now take a small break. And of course, at 4 o'clock, we will be having Nilesha, who will be talking to us in the thematic session. Now, that is going to be precisely at 4 o'clock. We welcome you to join us for coffee, tea, and refreshments at the lawns outside. And please do join us here before 4 o'clock.
Correct. Hello. Hello. Is it audible? Check. Check.
It's easier because the camera can also look at you. You can communicate with. No, but which camera are they using? That camera. What? Which one? Which camera are they using? So, test
Nay, nay, एक minute. Listen, you have any camera that side?
So we have 6 cameras.
Connect that camera. No, I'm here.
Check. Check one. Check one.
Hello. इसको टेस्ट कर ही रहे हैं ए, सर थोड़ा इसको उठाना पड़ेगा हाँ माइक ऑन हेलो एम आई ऑडिबल हेलो टेस्ट वन हेलो आईसीसी हेलो हेलो या एम आई ऑडिबल हेलो टेस्ट 1 2 3 हेलो एम आई ऑडिबल हेलो टेस्ट माइक टेस्ट डाउन करो बस यही रहो हेलो टेस्ट माइक 1 2 3 हेलो चेक माइक हेलो हेलो वहाँ से या ऑडिबल सर yes audible but little bit your sound mic gain is low please increase the mic gain नहीं आवाज आ रही सर बिल्कुल लो आ रही आप थोड़ा माइक का गेन बढ़ाएंगे हल्का सा जहां से आपकी माइक आ रहे हैं माइक से आवाज दे रहे हैं ना तो माइक से थोड़ा गेन बढ़ाइए बढ़ाओ थोड़ा अपना यहाँ से. Just wait, sir. Hello, test 1 2 3. Yeah, right. Thank you, sir. Perfect. Perfect, sir. Perfect. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Perfect है. सर आई रिक्वेस्ट यू सर प्लीज कुछ सेंटेंस बोलेंगे कंटिन्यू मोर देन 50 वर्ड्स. हेलो, एम आई ऑडिबल सर? हेलो, हेलो. उनके वहाँ पे क्या ये फ्रीज होके जा रहा क्या? ये हमारा फ्रेम उनके डिस्प्ले पे. हाँ, डिस्प्ले पे चला लेकिन बड़ा फ्रीज होके जा रहा, मतलब उनको मेरा लैग तो करेगा. कुछ सेंटेंस बुलाएंगे, एक दो वर्ड का. हेलो, 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 हेलो. टेस्ट 1 2 3 चेक. माई टेस्ट 1 2 3 4 5 6. इट इज ओके सर.
All speakers and mics are all okay, but we can't hear this one. Last trial, Ramadan sir, but
We cannot hear you.
now we can't hear you. मेरा नाम प्रशांत है सर. सुनील 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 नाम है मेरा.
यार इतना ये फेस काला क्यों दिख रहा है? हाँ?
हमने कोई म्यूट वगैरह थोड़ी किया.
नहीं, हमारे पास कोई कंट्रोल नहीं है. Now audible.
Yes sir, now we can hear.
Okay, okay. Thank you, sir.
अपनी तरफ से बोलना कुछ.
Hello, hello. Am I audible, sir? Check 1 2 3. Hello, hello. Test 1 2 3. Can you hear me?
No sir, not now.
Yes, miss. No, no. अरे
No audio.
ए
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. आ रहा है सर. हाँ, आवाज गूंज रहा है सर आपका आवाज थोड़ा. ई- अभी सही है सर थोड़ा. सर फ्यू सेंटेंस. हाँ हाँ सर. राइट सर, राइट सर. हाँ ठीक. आया है सर.
हाँ सर, आपकी आवाज़ सर आपकी आवाज़ आ रही है, लेकिन बीच बीच में हमें लग रहा है अभी वहाँ पे जो डिस्टरबेंस हो रही है उसकी वजह से थोड़ा क्लियर नहीं आ रही. हाँ 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 बिल्कुल क्लियर आ रही है. बाकी जैसे बीच में अभी लग रहा है कोई बोल रहा है, बीच में कोई और बोल दे रहा है, कोई और. उस टाइम पे जब आप स्पीच करेंगे मतलब. ओके ओके. और अभी आप बताइए कि मेरी तरफ से कैसा आवाज़ आ रहा है आपको. हाँ. एक्चुअली एक्चुअली क्या, आपको सुनने के लिए आप अपना स्पीकर का वॉल्यूम जितना रखना चाहते हैं उतना रख सकते हैं. ओ- हाँ हाँ आपका क्लियर है सर, अभी क्लियर है. थैंक यू सर. यही सेटिंग रखना सर बीच में, मतलब मेन बीसी में कोई डिस्टरबेंस मत करना, जो मतलब अभी जो ट्रायल हुआ है सेम सेटिंग रखना, ठीक है सर. ओके, थैंक यू सर, थैंक यू.
Good afternoon. What I say about India, please remember opposite is also true. About 1 kilometer from my office building, we have world's largest slum. And I can also see one of the biggest building in Mumbai. We are a bundle of contradictions. If we see over last 20 odd years, and especially in last 10 years, India has transformed. From fiscal profligacy, we moved to fiscal prudence. And this year, the deficit target at 4.8% was ahead of market expectation. In banks, day has come where a small Indian bank called Shamrao Vikral Cooperative Bank has to say, SVC मतलब वो अमेरिकन बैंक जो डूब रहा है, not us. Inflation from double digit we have become moderate. There was a time when Hindi film heroines used to sing Mehngai Maar Gayi. Now, no Hindi film heroine or Kannada film heroine will be talking about inflation. Effects from prices pledging gold to secure loans. We have now moved to surplus, fourth largest FX reserve holder in the world. Infrastructure in the city of Bangalore to talk about infrastructure. But please remember, I work in BKC. I have all the right to talk about infrastructure. From deficiency, we are moving to availability, if not in the city, at least outside of city. Most important is the mindset. Since the time Saurav Ganguly took his t-shirt on Lord's balcony, I think Indian mindset has moved from being tentative to confidence. And fortunately, we saw that in the Perth Test match today. SSV Jaiswal and played out beautiful inning. We have transformed from fragile five to fastest growing major economy. And obviously, there is a long way forward. Our challenge is not growth, our challenge is uneven growth. 13 districts of India, including around Bangalore, gives half of India's GDP. 692 other districts gives balance half. 13 equal to 692 mathematically is not correct, but in real life, that's happening in our own country. When China betted, there was a betting pitch. Unfortunately, when our time has come, it's changing. The world is moving from globalization to protectionism. President Trump will only accelerate. Ample liquidity to tight or adequate liquidity as inflation roars its head. Zero and low interest rates to elevated or higher interest rates. I don't give them to environmental to now bothering about environmental. Unipolar to multipolar world. And disruptions, which is both in size and scale. In this changing environment, we have to succeed. How many of you have heard about this gentleman? Well, what a stupid question. How many of you have heard about the Desi Elon Musk? Forget about you, even Google hasn't heard about it. I tried searching for Desi Elon Musk and I couldn't find a single article on it. All credit to Professor Ashok Jhunjhunwala who introduced us to Desi Elon Musk. There are 7 kids in Chandigarh Engineering College, not IIT, a third-year engineering college. They decided to make a jet engine. They raised 60 lakh rupees. 60 lakh rupee. And collectively, those 7 kids in Chandigarh have made the rocket engine of 4,500 Newton thrust. Commercial rocket engine market for putting a small payload in orbit is 25,000 newtons. Will those kids, when they become engineer, be able to make 25,000 Newton thrust engine? Answer is quite likely, whether Google recognizes it or not. We have talent. How do we convert this talent into successful entrepreneur? How many of you have heard about or seen this gentleman? Unlikely. This is a Nobel laureate which India could have had, but we didn't. His name is Dr. Subhas Mukhopadhyay. He got double doctorate in reproductive biology from the University of Kolkata and University of Edinburgh. Unlike in those days where talent used to go abroad, he decided to return back to India and Kolkata. In 1978, he created India's first test tube baby while working as a lecturer in a college. That girl Durga or Kanupriya Aggarwal has very recently come in public to talk about Dr. Subhas Mukhopadhyay. More importantly, India's first test tube baby was created just 67 days afterwards. World's first test tube baby called Louisa Brown. A small Google search about how many Indian scientists have died in suspicious situation gives this kind of disclosure. Talent is the only thing which can drive India forward. We need to protect our talent both from internal as well as external forces. Second, talent wants ease of doing business. And I'm not going to read any of these things, but please pray for our entrepreneurs. You have to maintain health record of your Indian cook. If I don't maintain health record of my 81 years old mother, that's fine. But if I'm running a factory and I have a canteen, I need to maintain health record of my canteen cook. Canteen wall needs to be whitewashed. And the definition of whitewash is as per the inspector, not as per the law. The door has to swing in particular direction under law. The workroom temperature has to be fixed as per law. Colors of official register for attendance, that paper thickness and ink both are prescribed under law. Wage slip has to be of particular font size. Restroom dimensions and driver uniform colors are specified under law. Drinking water temperature has been fixed by law. Anything below or above can put you behind the bars. Availability of spittoons. हुक्मरानी चली गई but कानून अभी भी रह गया है. And bicycle racks for cycling workers. These are some of the things which I have picked up randomly. All these things put our entrepreneur behind. This needs to be dismantled. Hopefully, we'll be able to improve ease of doing business. That will allow us talent to score well. Talent, apart from ease of doing business, requires capital. And while this picture is not looking that sharp, it's essentially a desert and iceberg. Most of our entrepreneurs are complaining that we don't have access to capital. And Indians are having a large portion of savings, which is frozen like an iceberg. Collectively, in first 21 years of this century, we have imported $373 billion of gold on a net basis. 1,000 tons import, 300 ton exports of jewelry, 700 ton किसी के लॉकर में किसी की तिजोरी में. Now, gold smuggling, all of us know, was prevailing. And if you ever return on a flight from Singapore or Middle East, apart from you will find that rest of the flight is cousin brothers of Bappi Lahiri wearing so much of gold jewelry. Will it be fair to say that as Indians we would have spent $500 billion in import of gold and silver, diamond and pearls, officially and unofficially? Your guess is as good as mine. The World Gold Council has also given up on India. Their estimate of our holdings have remained at 25,000 tons for last 20 years. In first 21 years, we have imported 15,000 tons. Prior to that, your guess is as good as mine. Where is this gold lying? In tijoris, in safe deposit lockers? It's a frozen iceberg while our entrepreneurs are searching for capital. If there is a magic through which we can defreeze that iceberg, and Indian entrepreneurs get access to capital at a cheaper rate, your guess is as good as mine. We can't blame government alone. All of us have to blame ourselves. All over the world, savers wants to make money. In India, ulta hai ekdam. Wherever there is an opportunity to lose money, we line up. For example, in cryptos, 18 crore Indians have traded, and most of them have lost money. NFTs, lesser said, the better. Futures and options trading, so many people have lost their futures in option trading. Online gaming, 18 crore Indians play games and majority of them lose money. Scam. There was a company called Payal Nath Corporation Limited. Decades back, they raised 60,000 crore from gullible investors. In my mutual fund, I would have delivered 18 to 20% compounded return to investors. And I wish I could have raised money like Payal Nath Corporation Limited. We need to convert Indian savers from just savings to investment so that capital could be made available to our entrepreneurs. Otherwise, we'll have to depend upon foreign capital. Today, if there is a good result coming out of India's largest automobile company, largest FMCG company, largest bank, largest asset management company, largest private sector insurance company, largest telecom company, largest FMCG company, there are more fatakis going out in New York and Tokyo and London than in Mumbai and Bangalore and Jaipur, because all those companies are majority owned by foreigners. How many of you knew this gentleman? He is the greatest fraudsters of all time, Bernie Madoff. Apparently, उसने $65 billion का चूना लगाया था. How many of you knew this? And recovered $19 billion of Bernie Madoff's scam money. He went after every member of Bernie Madoff, including selling their personal belongings like clothes and bags. He went after estate of a deceased investor and collected money out of him. And he ensured that not even a single person lost money in Bernie Madoff scam. This is the rule of law. Now look at India, National Spot Exchange, 1991-92 Harshad Mehta scam. Where is collection? Where is recovery? We need to provide rule of law to our entrepreneurs so that they can create entrepreneurship. Our rule of law has to make significant improvement. Now, many of us had our motor cars with Sun films. Most of us had some time back. One fine day, a court order came because some Noble Saul had filed a public interest litigation in Delhi where the court decided that under Motor Vehicles Act passed by Baba Adam or Britishers, you could not have stick a film through the car window. What was the loss of this decision? There were so many units which were making those Sun films, all of them shut down. There were so many mechanics who were putting those Sun films and having job. They had to shift. Collectively, we as a consumer were using those Sun country which believes this is a risk. You can have dark windows, you can have curtains on car windows, but you can't put transparent films. From here, we have to jump to Bernie Madoff case recovery efficiency, and which is why it is so important to have judicial reforms which can assure investors and entrepreneurs that you can do your business. Many years back, you would have heard about ozone layer depletion. It was threatening the world. Unfortunately, in those days, the Montreal Protocol was created, whereby Western world provided capital and technology to developing world so that ozone depleting gases can be removed out of circulation and we can produce ozone friendly gases for refrigeration. Time has come to create New Delhi Protocol, where countries which have already destroyed environment by emitting carbon gives money and technology so that developing countries can also pursue path of growth and we get money and technology to do it. As we speak, there is COP29 going in Azerbaijan. Developed world started with $100 billion. Developing worlds are at $1.3 trillion. Yesterday night, I heard developed world has come to $250 billion, but the need is $1.3 trillion a year. There's a need for New Delhi Protocol to ensure that our entrepreneurs have level playing field in rest of the world. Europe will come with green steel, green aluminium, and so many other green things to greenwash their own crimes, and we should not let that happen. Finally, we have moved from majority government to coalition politics, and there are few things which can happen in coalition government, few which cannot. And this will have different kind of impact on growth. Uniform Civil Code, population control bill kind of contentious things will be relegated to the background. Fair enough, we can manage that. Few things will continue to happen. In last 10 years, India has doubled its infrastructure. That infrastructure spending, including renewable energy, is creating growth that moved India from 10th largest economy in 2014 to 5th largest now, and eventually will become 3rd largest. Digital India, we are first world country. The rest of the world is far behind us. Defense and R&D boost. With two special neighbors, we have no option but to keep on investing for defense and R&D. Employment, skilling, housing, all these things are continuing even in a coalition government. And the most important thing in the coalition government which has been achieved is fiscal prudence. Many other countries are spending their way out of trouble. We are one of the rare country which has pursued the path of fiscal prudence. Between subprime crisis and COVID crisis, we are the only major economy in the world which has reduced its debt to GDP ratio. No other country has been able to achieve that. There are few things which will happen in true Indian style: 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Asset monetization, dheere dheere, free trade agreements, slow and steady. Ease of doing business improving, but we need to jump and we are walking. There are few things which are unlikely to happen: land reform, labor reform, farm reform, judicial reform, strategic divestment, GST rationalization, and few things may result into reversal of reforms like pension. The thing which we are doing well will continue to ensure that India remains fastest growing major economy. This will ensure that India grows at 6, 7, 8%. If one day we can do asset monetization, ease of doing business in a more better way, and also unleash reforms on land, labor, judicial, India will probably go into double digit of growth. Hopefully, we will all develop that political will. We can give confidence to our politicians that if they do this kind of reforms, they'll get re-elected. Then double-digit growth of India is possible. We have to ensure that while doing all these things, we don't score self goals. Singur, everyone knows. Decades back, Tatas went there to set up a factory. They were thrown out. They went to Sanand. Today, Sanand exports about a couple of $1 billion of automobile. It has created jobs, growth, development. If India follows Singur model, there is limited hope for us. If India follows Sanand model, growth will continue. Why scoring self goal is important or not scoring self goal is important? Because we can't afford self goals. This is data from RBI. Some states have moved from new pension scheme to old pension scheme. Old pension scheme basically defined benefits. New pension scheme is basically defined contribution. There are states like Bihar, Jammu and Kashmir, some in northeastern, where bulk of their revenue, bulk of their tax revenue is only going in payment of pension. This is when they are on new pension scheme and not necessarily all of them are on old pension scheme. State like Bihar pays 49% of revenue only in payment of pension. If we go back to old pension scheme, probably 70-80% of their revenue will just go towards pension. There'll be no money left for salaries, police, education, or anything. Cost of scoring self goal is so high that we better not score any self goal. Finally, whatever I say about India, opposite is also true, because in one India we have three distinct subsets. 1% of Indians live lifestyle of a rich nation like France. 27% live lifestyle of middle income country like Indonesia. And 72% live lifestyle of a poor nation like Uganda. Viksit Bharat should be a country where there's no one living in sub-Saharan Africa standards. Can this happen? Well, how many of you know this place called Bansilal Pet in Telangana, Hyderabad? This was a couple of years back where it was neglected. No one was bothered about it, even though it was historical monument. Something akin to India prior to 1991. Great historian dhyan nahi rakh raha tha. Today, the same Bansilal Pet is transformed into a tourist attraction. It attracts daily thousands of tourists. It's a place of, again, historical significance. I hope with all the steps which I have suggested, in 2047, India will be like this. If we can do it in Bansilal Pet, we can do it in our country also. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this invaluable session, sir. Yeah. Do we have time for questions? Can we?
I have time.
We can take a couple of questions if anyone would like to ask them, please. Yes, to felicitate our esteemed speaker, can we please have Mr. Pradeep Mishra, Group CFO of Stanley Lifestyles Limited. He's the man who took the company for a successful listing. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Pradeep Mishra again to honor Mr. Nilesh Shah with a memento.
Okay. Hey, please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Well, thank you, Meenakshi. Please give us a couple of minutes while we set up the stage for our next session, the plenary session on industry and society. That will be chaired by Lakshmi Narayan K.R. Lan, Chief Endowment Officer at the Azim Premji Invest.
Sorry, but you will have to
Tell them the positioning. We have to tell them the positioning, and also the cameras need to check it for this. Well, thank you for your patience. The circular stage does require us to do a bit more engineering to make sure we're able to catch everybody on the camera. For those of you who have just joined us right now for the evening session, thank you and welcome to the 8th India Ideas Conclave brought to you by the India Foundation and the WMG Group. Now, this is the plenary session, Industry and Society. And leading the conversation on this session will be Lakshmi Narayan K.R. or Lan, as he is fondly known to all of us, who is the Chief Endowment Officer at the Azim Premji Foundation. If I could request Lan to kindly join us on the stage and take the seat, please. Please give a big round of applause to Lakshmi Narayan K.R. Lan. Joining Lan in this conversation is Ashish Dhawan, the co-founder of the Convergence Foundation. Ashish. Please join me in welcoming on stage Komal Hiranandani, the founder and CEO of Dolce V.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joining us now on stage, Mudit Kapoor, the Associate Professor of Economics at the Indian Statistical Institute.
Okay.
And please now welcome on stage Sriram Balasubramaniam, economist and the author of Dharmonomics. This is the plenary session, Industry and Society, and Lan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to this session. It's always a tough act to follow Nilesh, and that's why, since we couldn't do it alone, we said we'll come together to try and match part of what Nilesh has done. But good thing is that Nilesh brings so much energy in this session that it should rub off on something that we do. But then we are here to talk on a topic which is uh, interesting, and I'm saying interesting because at one level, industry and society is actually something that's symbiotic. Industry exists within the society, but very often the fact that is it industry versus society is also a question that comes up automatically. Fundamentally, of course, it's the fact that industry exists to fulfill and solve problems the society has, and the society gives it license to exist and unlock the resources it has. So it should really not be thing, but over a period of time, uh, this topic has come about. But as we imagine Brand Bharat, uh, and we start thinking of what it can be over the next decade, I think what we will try and do in our session will be to see how do we imagine the relationship between industry and society in a manner that aids building this brand. And to do that, I'm joined by four wonderful people with very diverse experiences, backgrounds, and points of view that in my conversations with them, I'm already hugely excited. And the best way to show that is that I'm going to do the least of the talking. So what I'm going to do as a format is to request each one of the panelists to share their perspectives on this topic uh, for a few minutes, and then we'll take questions from there. I have some questions, and I'm hoping that we'll have enough time for questions from the audience as well. So may I first request Ashish, and Ashish brings this interesting perspective. He's been a capital allocator. He's run businesses. Now he's been deeply involved on the social side. Runs foundations. He's been part of the policy. So that's that very rich perspective. And Ashish, with that and much more that you bring, your thoughts.
No, thank you, Lan. I think one of the key roles of industry is to create jobs. And while India has done a good job at growing at 6-7% over the last 3 decades, I think we can do a much better job. And as we think of Viksit Bharat, not only growing at a more rapid pace, 9-10% versus 6-7%, but also in a more job-intensive manner. So I want to talk about 3 areas in particular, which I think can make a difference if we were to prioritize these areas. The first is labor-intensive exports. Historically, I mean, even over the last 30 years, as we have grown, we have really ignored labor-intensive exports. China dominates the world of labor-intensive exports. It has 30% global market share. In some categories, the market share is as high as 70-80%. India's global market share is just north of 3%, even though our biggest endowment is labor. And so if you look at a category like electronics, where our exports were 7 billion in 2014, now it's gone up to 30 plus billion. But China exports 900 billion of electronics. The Honorable Prime Minister just announced a $500 billion mission for electronics, which is what I think the country needs. It'll create another, 6 million direct jobs and probably 12 million indirect jobs. But what it'll need is a combination of things to happen. I think one of the things we've done in these sectors is addressed it incrementally. And what I see now is a coming together of 5-6 things that have to happen at the same time for us to be competitive. Obviously, PLI is working in some areas like mobile. We've seen it's been very, very successful. And now there's a component PLI. So some kind of incentive, which is for an infant industry to get started.
We need to rationalize our tariffs. Our import duty on a weighted basis is about 9% for components. Vietnam is at sub 1%. So we really need to rationalize tariffs if we want to be competitive. We need large export zones. In Vietnam, there are 6 designated zones out of which this happens. In India, it's naturally started to happen around Hosur, Sri Perumbudur, in Greater Noida. But designating these zones and devolving power down so that the ease of doing business can really happen, the way we have a separate act for Dholera, needs to happen. We need labor laws to be flexed by the states. We need a dormitory policy, which was announced by the finance minister now to get spelled out in some degree of detail. And anchor tenants to come in. Apple was one, which we keep talking about, but we need 10 other Apples. They may not be the same size as Apple, but we need the major OEMs to come because they'll bring their supply chain with them. So this is just one example of electronics where there is a $300 billion export opportunity and maybe a $200 billion domestic opportunity just in the next 7-8 years, and will create, over 10 million jobs. Garments is an area where we've just given up. Our garment exports are something like $16-17 billion flat for the last decade. Bangladesh does 50 billion, Vietnam does 50 billion. China, despite having much higher costs, despite the China plus one, the issues with China, still has 150 billion. This is the most labor-intensive sector. Shahi Exports, our largest exporter, has $1 billion of revenue, creates 125,000 jobs. There's no other sector with this labor intensity. So Bangladesh, our neighbor, has created almost 5 million jobs, 90% for women in this sector. So I think a mission-like approach towards labor-intensive exports is what India needs. We need to go from 3% to 10% global market share. And then once we hit that threshold, aspire for 20% global market share in labor intensive. And it will create tens of millions of jobs in India. And these jobs will have a multiplier effect on the domestic economy. A second area I'll point to, which is not as obvious, is actually labor export. So India already has been a large exporter of labor to West Asia. But if you look at the demographics of the OECD, they are going to need immigrants. Despite the rhetoric, I can assure you that while they may not want permanent immigrants, they will definitely want temporary immigrants. Japan already has 2 million migrants. South Korea has 1.5 million. And Europe, Germany wants drivers, cooks, you name it. Anyway, and the estimate is the Western world alone will need about 50 million people in the next 25 years. And I think India has the opportunity to be the provider of safe and responsible talent to the rest of the world, because our people are good citizens when they go outside, and they have the requisite skill sets to make it happen. So yet another opportunity to create 10 plus million jobs. And for that, if you look, Philippines for me is a role model. What Philippines has done, Philippines gets almost 8.5% of its GDP in remittances. What it has done is it's got a department for overseas Filipinos. They have accredited private agencies, 3,400 private agencies who are the skill providers. They provided a credit guarantee for the loan taken by the individual for the skill, which is $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 to get the skill. They have harmonized their credentials with global. They have signed 65 G2G agreements. So they've created the enabling conditions for this to happen. I think India can do this too, and we can be the preferred supplier of talent to the world. And a third opportunity, and I know I need to wrap up, is tourism. There's been a lot of talk in Viksit Bharat itself. There's the aspiration to go to $3 trillion from almost $200 billion today. But I think in the next decade alone, we can triple our revenue from tourism. Our revenue from international tourism is paltry. It is very, very small today. And I think one way to get around it is what we have done in Kevadia. The Kevadia has a special act which designates powers to a CEO who then can develop the infrastructure, develop a tourism plan, the touristic.
Right now I was told, the lady who had curated this event, if there is one mistake she's made, it's me. To be very honest, I don't know. Whatever I had to say has already been said. In fact, the joke I wanted to crack has also been cracked. So I'm quite frankly very speechless. Having said that, I mean, what I would like to start with on a very serious note is there are two fundamental laws that govern economists. We've had an economist yesterday, we've had an economist today. The two laws about economists is that the first law is that to every economist, there's an equal and an opposite economist. That's the first one. And the second law is both of them are wrong. So, unbelievably, but having said that, I want to make a point on when I got this topic in my own characteristic way, I read my emails very quickly. I forgot the and. I read this topic as industrial society. And I immediately framed in my mind what are the implications of industrial society or a modernized society, which the Prime Minister talks about in terms of Viksit Bharat. And immediately, as a student of economic history, institutions, and philosophy, it occurred to me that I should also talk about the cost of industrial society. And it's important to think about the cost of industrial society because the Industrial Revolution, which unleashed the industrial society, was perhaps the biggest social engineering program unleashed on humanity in the history of mankind. And this transformation essentially was, the pre-industrial society, the economics was embedded in society. Land, labor, capital, they were governed by social norms, traditions, culture. But in a modern industrial society, land, labor becomes a commodity. It's not a question now, these are not governed by interpersonal relations anymore. They are governed in the form of a commodity by a very, very interesting mechanism, which in a market economy nobody controls, which is the price mechanism, which essentially is a very interpersonal thing. For example, if I, as a commodity, my marginal productivity is zero, then my humanity doesn't really matter. I am immaterial from society's perspective. I no longer am a useful society, a commodity in society. And unfortunately, the mechanism in a modern society is that your value is not determined by you or what you bring to the table. It is determined essentially by how scarce you are. So it does not really matter whether you have value in use. What matters is value in exchange. If there are many people who can do my job, even if I work for 24 hours, my wages are going to be extremely low. So some of us who command a wage premium in a market-based society, they reflect not some intrinsic characteristic, but they reflect the scarce commodity in how scarce they are in commodity. But this social transformation that took place from pre-industry to industrialization was actually a very, very violent event as well. This did not happen in a very peaceful manner as one would imagine. It unleashed forces which also created, the cost of which was that you created industrial scale killing as well, industrial scale violence, which unfortunately the technology has two sides to it. At one end, it can make life easy, but at the other end, it can unleash sort of weapons that can kill at an industrial scale. And if you look at Europe, for example, if you look at yesterday, they were talking about development of Germany and Japan. Ultimately, its social transformation culminated in those countries, eventually leading to World War II. And we know what happened in World War II. In terms of the scale of killing that took place, it was industrial scale. You have to, if you just marvel the technology that was being used, it was something which was totally unprecedented. And if you look at, even if you go back, you look at French Revolution, for example, this is precisely an industrial society, a transformation taking place, which is transforming a political system itself, right? And it unleashed in violence, which was totally unpredictable. If you come closer to the times we live in, if you look at, for example, the Iranian Revolution, what was the Shah trying to do? He was trying to modernize society. And what did the Ayatollah discover? He discovered it was very difficult to teach people how to live. It was a lot easier to teach people how to die. So the whole Islamic revolution in itself was one of the first revolution of its kind because it was telling people to go back to the glorious past. It was not talking about the glorious future, it was talking about the glorious past. So unfortunately, when we think about the industrial society, we think of the developed aspect of it, but the contradictions that are imposed on society because of this social transformation is something which, in my opinion, the present Prime Minister of India recognizes these contradictions. And I'll give you an example. Take, for example, the farm laws. My colleague Shamika Ravi ji, she mentioned that the farm laws, the withdrawal of the farm laws was a bad idea. From an economics perspective, yes. But if you look at the sociological aspect of it, it was, in my opinion, a very smart retreat. Because once again, we are talking about getting a market-based economy where relationships, governance of the norms are determined by the social norms, the traditions that are there in place. And there was resistance to it. The resistance comes to it because this modern society unleashes, it questions the traditional power centers. And if you look at another aspect of the violence the industrial society or the industrial revolution or the modernizing unleashed was on nature itself. Nature itself became a commodity. The question was that we thought that there's so much abundance of it that we need not price it. Right? So as a result, the kind of violence that was unleashed on nature itself, today we are asking that, have we done the right thing? Are we on the right path or not? And if you think about it, the Prime Minister's vision, it's surprising. The political class understands this contradiction. Yesterday, we had Professor Pandagariya talk about labor laws. Ashish has also talked about labor laws. It's true that we need to reform labor laws. It's true when Professor Panagariya said that India adopted the socialistic system and that was a mistake. But from a political perspective, you have to ask yourself a question. Is your society ready for development and modernization itself? Is there a political mandate for modernization and industrialization itself? And I think, whatever may be my political differences, this is the first prime minister who has made development into a political mandate. This is what he's trying to unleash in society, is to bring about a transformation without having to pay the cost that the society pays in terms of violence. This, in my opinion, is a very, very heroic step. So this strategic retreat that he makes, that he withdrew the farm laws, one has to keep in mind that he is unleashing in India a program of development that questions, that in fact challenges many of the traditions and norms that govern our relationship. Another violence that has been unleashed on society due to modernization is the family structure. Now, that's not the kind of violence, violence is always not necessary having any kind of bloodshed. But you look at when labor became a commodity itself, we asked for women to participate in the formal labor market. And what are we seeing in traditional society? If you look at Japan, South Korea, which were far more traditional than societies in Europe, their fertility rates have come down to be below 1. Right? If you look at Europe, their fertility rates are much higher than what you see in traditional societies like Japan and South Korea. And today, the question is being asked on how do we revive that. So there is a cost to the industrial society, but what is remarkable, in my opinion, At one end, you have a prime minister who wants to modernize. But at the other end, he does participate in traditional and cultural events. For example, the Ayodhya temple that was built in January. Very often, as an economist, we are asked a question: what is the role that the leadership plays in this? The leadership is demonstrating to society that it wants to preserve the traditions and norms of society while at the same time it wants to modernize. And the state has a very important role to play in this, because when labor becomes a commodity, when all relationships become a commodity, the social insurance which typical tradition and culture norms are providing are also going to disappear. You see, that is the cost of urbanization in some sense. I have not known my neighbor for a very long period of time. In fact, when my neighbor is going through some kind of a crisis, I'm not even aware of it. Then who has to step in? So therefore, a modern society requires a very strong state. A very strong state, because now we have nuclearization of family, commoditization of labor, which basically demands that the state, the traditional role which the family was putting, the social norms were playing, now that role has to be played by the government. And therefore, in that context, the welfare state becomes important. So it's not welfare state, development state. I think we economists have to look at the broader picture, bring in the sociological changes that will accompany modernization, and these costs have to be taken into consideration. And I'm very glad, actually, that we have a prime minister who's cognizant. I mean, if you look at the slogans, he's talking about life. I mean, how do we live a sustainable life? So at one end, he wants society to modernize, but at the other end, he's also reminding society through a political slogan that we have to be mindful and we have to be careful about the sustainable nature. And mind you, when we talk about China's modernization, we must not forget their attempt to modernize, which started with the Great Leap Forward, killed 40 to 50 million people. The state starved 40 to 50 million people to death. That was the start of the modernization program in China. So it's come at a huge cost. So, in my opinion, I unfortunately viewed this topic as industrial society. I sincerely apologize for that. I prepared my talk from the perspective of industrial society, so I humbly acknowledge that this is not industry and society. But I think we have to be cognizant of the cost. I'm very glad that the political leadership is very cognizant about the social transformation of modernizing, and that to modernizing the largest and the biggest, and perhaps one could argue traditionally and culturally one of the most complex countries or civilization, which is a living civilization, which has a tradition, which has a deep-rooted tradition. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mudit, and in your own inimitable way, you really spoke of the topic and about the topic, and so thank you for that. And that takes me to Sriram, and Sriram's research area, and we spoke a little about it, and also the books he's written is about the, the cultural context in policy making, and like he likes it, the way of life and how that informs policies both at industrial level and at overall macro level. Sriram would love to, and especially after having set the context of costs that Mudit brought about, I think this is a perfect stage for you to bring some of your research and wisdom that you picked up.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Namaskar to everyone. It provides a perfect segue to what I'm sort of going to discuss. I would start off with, probably two research questions, which sort of, determines my approach to both my books as well as some of the topics that we're discussing. The first question really is, I would like to go back to what Ashwin Sanghi mentioned a couple of sessions back, where, the concept of hard power, right? As India becomes a superpower or in the path towards being a superpower, its ideas and its sort of historical context becomes far more mainstream. In the sense, the basic question one would ask is, what is the indigenous Bharatiya model? of economic governance, right? It's a very simple question, but the answers are not, as clear. Is it the Swadeshi model? You know, with a lot of respect for Swadeshi, I think Swadeshi is sort of a political phenomena morphed into a sort of an economic entity for, in the context of the freedom movement and things like that. But if you really look at our past, thousands of years of Bharatiya history, when India and China were the top countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita, from 0 C onwards, at least till the 17th century, you notice that this country has been um, consistently engaging with the world, which means trading with the world, exchanging ideas with the world, and sort of having an economic worldview which is far more inclusive than you could ever see. So this question led me to look at our past. If there are any economic frameworks that led to this progress, when you look at the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, it's probably one of the most intriguing monuments. Besides being a temple, that despite so many centuries, it stands tall, and its architectural brilliance, and it's very difficult to even replicate even today. So did all these monuments just come out of thin air? I think that's a fair question to ask, right? Such brilliance of, say, engineering and architecture there had to be some sort of underpinning of a philosophy that sort of ensured or triggered such progress. So that led me to the Arthashastra, which is the Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is a 3rd century BCE text. Forgive me for sort of giving you some context, but I think it would, enrich the discussion. It provides an overview of the economics of what Kautilya thought about. And I, in my book, I address this through the prism of dharmic capitalism. The idea of dharma being sort of central to the thinking of Kautilya and a lot of our ancient thinkers, which looks beyond the binary of the state and the market. In the sense, in a modern sort of economic framework, we have the state which regulates, which taxes, and which sort of stimulates the economy. And then you have the market, which sort of, provides competition, enlarges firms, and creates the market space for ideas. Kautilya sort of envisaged a concept where, dharma plays a supporting role to both the state and the market, foundational role. And this is something that you see across a lot of these kingdoms. So in the first book, I sort of addressed this, define dharma through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and harmony, and map to the role of the state and sustainable growth and wealth creation and things like that. And I extend that in my next book, which is Dharmanomics, just got released a couple of days back, which focuses on the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pallavas, Pandyas, Kamboja Desa in Cambodia, in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And where you see various iterations of the same dharma-based economic framework in all of these countries over thousands of years. And that includes even the temple-based economies, which we talk about, which is, again, I think, an inherent core of Bharat and its importance in these societies. And the role of guilds, corporate guilds, which are like multinational corporations and things like that, right? So all these things sort of, it might sound historical, but I think it's very important to sort of draw inspiration from all these things, because if you look at all the Western models, even modern day capitalism is an offshoot of a Protestant ethic. So the Chinese economic model is an offshoot of a lot of their inherent ideas, the Chinese ideas. The same thing with the Japanese. In fact, the Japanese have a subdivision of economic history within the Ministry of Finance, which shows a lot of their indigenous ideas as a springboard for economic policy. Why I'm saying this is important is at some level, we have to draw inspiration from some of these ideas, because the extension of all this is the way of life that we're talking about today. The dharmic way of life is a representation of what we are today in terms of not just the societal choices that we make. We still have these temples in every other villages that you go to. For example, in Tamil Nadu, we have thousands of temples. Most of them in even a small village, you have a big temple and you have much smaller temples around. And one needs to look beyond the religiosity of these institutions. They provide an economic catalyst for that entire area. If there is one institution in a particular village in Bharat which triggers economic activity, it is probably the temple as an institution, as an economic institution. And the ecosystem around the temple is an economic institution. And this is a great opportunity for decentralized economic governance and expanding decentralized economic processes. So I think it's very important to sort of understand this, to look at the indigenous sort of economic model that we have. And then look at the way of life. The way of life is again an important construct. Similar to what Mudit said, norms, narratives, and institutions play a very important role in economic decision making, both at the individual level and at the firm level. So at the individual level, if you look at both, in terms of discretionary, not non-discretionary spending, which is basically non-discretionary is essential spending. Discretionary is, in very simple terms, non-essential spending. Most of our expenditures are all linked to our cultural events throughout the year. If you take maximum UPI transactions this year was during the week during Diwali, where most of us made most of our expenditures, discretionary expenditures during that year. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of the consumption cycle is dependent, especially on the discretionary side, is dependent on a lot on the cultural norms and narratives that we have. Similarly, if you look at the corporate world, if you take the top 15 companies in India today, at least 10, 11 of them are family-owned businesses. And family-owned businesses make economic choices based on the context and, more importantly, on the cultural norms and narratives. For example, Mukesh Ambani, when he's speaking to Jensen Huang recently, he talks about Diwali as sort of his new year, where he starts new projects and things like that. Whether it is Mukesh Ambani or whether it's individuals such as us, a lot of our economic decision making is dependent on a lot of these cultural norms and narratives. And this is widely studied in the West, by the way. If you really look at Nobel laureates like Gary Becker, one of his earlier works was on the role of, say, discrimination and culture in society. George Eichelroth, who won the Nobel for 2001 on asymmetric information, has also done a lot of work on identity economics, which talks about identities, norms, and narratives. Abner Grieve from Stanford has done it. But in a land where culture is so integral, unfortunately, we haven't done much work to even understand this. So I think this is very important for us to sort of understand this, because eventually this way of life, which has persisted for thousands of years, is not going to go away. And its influence on economic policy and decision making is going to be there. And not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of industry as well. And I think it's very important to sort of further understand this. I think it comes to, and one needs to also see how it can help in policy making. So, for example, we heard about the Kumbh Mela, which is going to happen in March. So the Kumbh Mela is the largest congregation of people probably in the world. But it's a huge opportunity for policymakers to experiment their policies. So, for example, if you want to create a Swachhata or a cleanliness drive, there's no bigger avenue to do that. So these are all opportunities. I think the prism of which economic policy is viewed in this country needs to fundamentally change. Because much of post-independent, Bharat, most of the people who are involved, I have a lot of respect for them, but I think there's a lot of democratization of ideas that need to come, and how real Bharat functions. And lastly, I want to draw the Prime Minister again, like what Mudit mentioned. He's a perfect example of someone who understands this, really at a ground level. If you really think about the Prime Minister's, post-independence, he's probably the only Prime Minister, I think, after Lal Bahadur Shastri, who's experienced poverty. In the sense, really experienced poverty. So his ability to understand the power of, say, an Ujjwala Yojana, the power of a Swachhata, a Swachh Bharat, I think is a supreme sort of understanding of this way of life that I'm talking about. The ability for policy, if it is aligned to the way of life, to be far more effective than the other way around. If you have a bunch of policymakers sitting in Delhi executing or showcasing policies which are sort of an anathema to the way of life, you're not going to get effective policy outcomes. There are going to be gaps. If you do it the reverse, I think it makes it far more effective. So if you take the example of, say, Swachh Bharat, right? If you notice that Swachh Bharat, in my view, has been far more effective in rural areas than in urban areas. One of the reasons, I ascribe is this ability of Saucham, which is cleanliness, I think, and a definition of dharma by itself, is inherently there in all our lives. We all try our best to be clean within our homes. If you sort of bring this ethos to the outside, to your neighborhood, through the mass, popularity and the campaign of the Prime Minister, you're able to see transformative changes in villages. For example, I've just been to a remote rural village in Tamil Nadu, which had an initial sort of Swachhata movement, and now I could see that most of the roads are very clean, except for the main bazaar road. The rest of it's almost on autopilot. So the effectiveness of policy has increased a lot more, in my view, because of when policymakers take policies and align it to the way of life. So I think the industry and society sort of discussion in the Indian Bharatiya context is far more complex, far more diverse. And I think it's high time that policymakers take a serious look at this. And one of my areas of research is to make an attempt to take a serious look at this, because if you really want to take the informal sector, the entire sort of, rural Bharat into action, while India becomes Viksit Bharat, I think understanding this is very, very important. Because if not, I think the buy-in that we seek from them in this transformation, is sought only through an understanding of this, in my view. Because we can do all the talk about all these big projects and, that's all great. But eventually, for the common man on the street, for him or her to have a buy-in in what we want to do, in the transformation that we are seeking, I think there has to be an inherent, first of all, understanding, and then empathy and sympathy to where they come from, and then initiating policy in a way that is aligned to some of these needs. And the more we study them, I think, the more you will understand between the sort of confluence between industry and society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. So, Komal, and Komal sort of brings all this together on the ground with what she does with Dolce V, which is to cater to the aspirations of the Indian youth with Indian frugality. So, how do you bring them all together, and what are your thoughts, Komal?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Dolce V is a platform for pre-owned fashion. We're working to boost the circular economy because of the urgent environmental imperative. So I'll speak more from the consumer point of view, how the consumer fits into this aspect of industry and society. So why do we all need to take a minute in the middle of all this very high level talk, infrastructure, jobs, all of this is very important. Why do we also need to take some time to think about the circular economy? For example, India, we already have a lot of customs that cause us to accumulate a lot of clothes. I think a lot of us can relate to this. Annual religious festival, buy new clothes, gift new clothes. Big life event, buy new clothes, gift new clothes. And on top of this, the way that our consumption is increasing is absolutely unparalleled. Our apparel industry is on track to reach a volume of over 40 billion pieces in the next 4 years. So for 1.4 billion Indians, that is a lot of clothes. Where are we going to keep them? Our storage capacity to keep these clothes is not increasing by that pace. And more importantly, our utilization capacity is limited by the fact that there are only 365 days in a year. So whether we have 100 or 700 clothes in our cupboards, there are only so many costume changes that one can make in a day. So we have to address this from both the demand and the supply side. And I think our sector really illustrates how industry can have a very unique opportunity at these moments where consumer behavior is making these big shifts to tap into these trends, turn them into something positive instead of allowing them to become negative externalities of growth, negative externalities of consumption. So firstly, when you acquire pieces, we all want to see economic growth. increase in consumption goes hand in hand with that. We have to find ways to accommodate increasing consumption. We have to find ways to accommodate a growth in aspiration. What are these people going to consume? We have to very actively and consciously nurture the circular economy as part of the mix of what people can choose from when they are making these aspirational purchasing decisions. Secondly, when people are looking to cycle out, either whether it's things from our closet or other things from our households, there's going to be a lot of excess in all aspects of what we consume. Spending our time, effort, resources on nurturing those industries that again look at channeling that excess productively, unlock economic value from it. Let me tell you, it's not easy to unlock economic value from this. It is a lot of logistics challenges. The unit economics can be really punishing. It takes someone really to put their heart and soul and that entrepreneurship zeal to crack this. People have tried, people have failed. We've got to keep at it. So these things are going to end up in the landfill if we don't facilitate that ecosystem of circularity. In the inaugural session, our honorable finance minister, she talked about how India should be leading global standards. She gave the example of the pharmaceutical industry, and she charged us to think about other sectors in which we can play a leading role in setting global standards. And for many reasons, the apparel market is a perfect candidate for this for many reasons. Firstly, a lot of people don't think of clothing as a source of pollution the way that we think of transport or electricity as a source of pollution, but it is. The fashion industry is responsible for 10% of our global carbon emissions. 20% of industrial wastewater is linked to just the dyeing and treatment of textiles. The average pair of jeans, the water that it takes to grow the cotton in just one pair of jeans is as much as a person drinks in 7 years. So if you are taking so much from the earth to make your product, if you are polluting so much into our planet to make what your industry is making, then at least we can say that have a minimum standard of durability. Whatever is made in India, whatever is sold in India, if we can have a policy that it should last at least 30 wears, then we're going somewhere. It's not too much to ask. It should not be threadballed and unusable after 1 or 2 washes. And this is a big problem that has been documented extensively, that the quality of textiles, the quality of apparel that we make has declined. What you could buy from the same, at the comparative price 10 years ago, 20 years ago, from the same brands, our quality has dipped. We've allowed that to happen, and we need to stop it in its tracks before it gets worse. India has a very rich textile industry. It's a very big part of our economy. So we ought to take charge in spearheading this field. Another reason that I think that this sector is really calls for some kind of a policy focus is because there's something about the human psyche that makes us susceptible to fall into consumption patterns that even we don't want to be a part of. It's a little bit like how there's more awareness about social media these days. We don't want to be doom scrolling. And when we look at ourselves from a distance, we say, I don't want to be doing that. But in the moment, we can't help themselves. There is a very strong parallel here. There is something about cheap fashion, something that looks aspirational, something that looks hip, and the price is accessible, that even if you don't want to be consuming in that way, you're drawn into it in the moment. So we've all heard of Shein, the very successful ultra fast fashion company selling a lot of clothes, but is also courting controversy because obviously of its very high environmental footprint. Who are Shein shoppers? The average Shein shopper has an income of over 55 lakh rupees a year. They are spending over $100 a month on Shein clothes. And more interestingly, surveys have found that over half of them say that I consider environmental sustainability to be a very important part of my priorities. And over 67% say I am willing to spend more for something that is more environmentally sustainable. So there is a clear dissonance between how we see us. And this is not judging, pointing at anyone. This is just how we need to understand, okay, there are certain demographic groups that are susceptible. So what do we as industry and policy need to focus on? So there's a dissonance between how we see ourselves and how we want to act, which is why this is an area that is ripe for some kind of regulation, some kind of standardization in terms of the quality that we need to demand And that's not to say, okay, now you can't make cheap clothes. I don't think anyone in this room subscribes to that kind of overregulation. And it's deeply unfair to price out people with lower budgets from these kinds of aspirational pieces. So the least we can then say is at least whatever, whether it's clothing, whatever we make in India, let's be proud about the fact that we built to last.
Oh, great. We've had some very interesting perspectives come, and I'm going to just do one round of questions. And quickly, uh, uh, Ashish, one of the challenge you talked of job creation as one of the thing. Where do you see skilling and the gaps in skilling fit into that in the vision of the three things that you talked of? And we can just make it quick round. I do want to give at least one chance for a couple of questions from the audience. So, skilling and gaps in skilling. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So my view is that the short-term skilling, which India followed for a long period of time, I don't think was very helpful. I think the model that we have now stumbled into, apprenticeships, internships, on-the-job training, demand-led training is much more meaningful. Also, we've got to remember that certain jobs don't require a lot of skills.
Right.
To win in the garments sector, I don't think we need a lot of skills. If you talk to any garments manufacturer, they'll tell you that in 2 to 3 months, the worker is skilled and productive already. So that sector requires a whole bunch of other policy reforms.
Right.
Frankly, the skilling doesn't matter so much. For overseas employment,
sure,
it's very important. You're going to a different country, you need language skills, you need credentials that are harmonized with that the other country, that are accepted, etc. So I think it depends on the job type.
Right.
But I'm very much in favor of demand-driven skilling versus just skilling where it was being sort of done in the ether almost. Whereas now I think as a country, we have a much sharper model that we have developed
Right. So
for training.
clearly you're saying that different ways one can do that, and that's what we are now trying to do versus the older models.
Absolutely. I think, of course, there's improvement to NAPs and things like that, but I think it's a great start. Even the Prime Minister's internship is a great start. I'm sure there'll be a lot of teething problems. It's a new issue. But eventually, it'll be great for our youth.
So, thanks. Mudit, you gave this example of industrial society and the cost it paid. Based on research and in history, are there examples of where this has been done at relatively lesser cost? You gave all examples of extremely high cost in terms of deaths and stuff like that. Do you have examples where it's been done better that one could learn from?
Of course, India is the living example. Unfortunately, this cost of industrialization was born because we became commodities. Even today, the whole attempt is to make ourselves. For example, I ask my students a fundamental question: what is your price? Because everybody wants to go to the job market, right? I don't ask them the question on how useful you are, but your price is your value in exchange. So in India, it is for the first time that you have a political leadership that wants to manage the cost of trying to preserve your tradition while at the same time moving towards modernization. The only other country that tried to do it but failed was Japan. So if you look at the Meiji Restoration, the whole slogan was that we'll preserve whatever is good about our tradition and we'll modernize at the same time. But we know what happened. By the time Japan industrialized, it was the first Asian country to beat a European power in 1905. Right? It announced itself in the world stage during the process of industrialization. So I really think that what is being attempted in terms of the political by the political class. I mean, you look at the slogan which is winning election. At one end, we want women to enter the labor force market. At the other end, the most popular slogan today politically is giving financial support to women who are in the household. You see, in some sense, what seems like a contradiction is a political class trying to manage a contradiction in a peaceful way, which has never been attempted before. Attempts in the sense that nobody wants violence. It just is an unintended consequence of modernizing. And I really think that, I'm really, really amazed at this because it is easy to criticize people who maintained status quo in the past, by saying they could have been a market economy. They understood the political implication of modernization. Examples were evident to them. And the other aspect I want to highlight is modernization does not happen because individuals want to modernize. We have to modernize because it is a necessity. You see, in 1962, when we faced China, China's per capita GDP was lower than ours. Chinese economy today, and I think the finance minister is very cognizant of the transformation that is taking place, is worried. We are very worried about their aggression and expansionist. So we have no option but to modernize if we have to stand up to the tendencies that will emerge. So we have no choice. But we have to do it with the least internal strife as possible. And that's why you see repeatedly political sloganeering apart. You are looking at why women, why not men? Don't the men feel discriminated that they're not being given the money, 4,000, 5,000 rupees? I'll be happy to receive that kind of money. But the women, because women is a source of our family tradition. Right. So you see the challenge that has to be managed, or the contradiction that has to be managed. I think India is one of the examples that is doing it through a democratic process. No other country has experimented industrialization through a democracy. Yesterday, I think Mr. Ram Madhav talked about political systems. What do they have to do with modernization? A lot. In fact, there's no empirical relationship between democracy and growth. But only recently did we see that democracy does cause growth, but not for the reasons that you think that they do. Democracy leads to growth because the non-democratic countries have been sanctioned by the powerful democratic countries. It's not that there is anything intrinsic in democracy which leads to growth. So you see, when you look at this research, you look at the contradiction, I'm just amazed at how the political leadership can consume such kind of sophisticated argument and come out with a practical plan which has to be implemented on the ground, not being discussed in some parlor or the other.
So managing contradiction through coexistence. Fantastic. Thank you, Mudit. Sriram, you talked a lot about the local economy, and you talked the examples of the village kind of thing. One aspect, which I'm just taking off from what Komal said, is about conservation. We talked too much of ESG and stuff like that, but environment was always a part of the whole of thing, and that's naturally embedded. And you've talked a little bit about that in your book as well. Would you like to just talk? How do you think about that, and how that's integrated?
Yeah, I think that's a natural sort of consequence. One of the differences, again, referring to Mudit, I think in the case of Bharat, there is one distinct difference, is that the way of life that I sort of was articulating is inherently as sustainable practices, not as some instrument of the state telling you to be sustainable, right? So there's a sort of a distinct difference there. Because it's inherently peace-loving, inherently inclusive, and it's inherently sustainable in a lot of its activities. So you don't need a sort of an incentive to do this. Of course, it needs to provide an incentive to sort of get their buy-in and sort of aligning it to their way of life, which I mentioned. But it doesn't really need an external sort of, state to come in and create an awareness about all these things to them, because they are inherently doing it. So to take it to the neighborhood and the society, of course, the state needs to sort of machinate that. So I think that's a very subtle but very important difference, right? Even if you look at Kautilya's time, 5th century BCE, I'm talking about, right? He views it through the prism of responsibilities, right? Familial responsibilities, societal responsibilities, environmental responsibilities. There are a lot of inscriptions which talk about the need to protect the environment, the need to reduce the amount of waste, the need to protect wildlife, and a variety of these sort of mentions are there in a lot of these texts. So I think when you look at it historically, there has been an attempt by a lot of the ancient thinkers to also look at it through that prism. So I think in a sense, for us to make this transition, we are inherently at an advantage, right? How do we sort of utilize the advantage? That is the smartness of the state and the shrewdness of the state, and how the state tries to understand this in the process of the transformation, right? So even in the Japanese sort of model, the Japanese still are even now fighting that battle in the sense, how do we ensure that because their society is very inherently sort of resisting to a lot of changes that the modern state wants it to do. So how do you sort of do this is I think a challenge for the state, more so in a democracy, because you want to have political outcomes which play a very important role in economic decision making, or if you want to pursue a set of these reforms. So a sort of an alignment is needed. But first, I think there needs to be an awareness. The political class is the awareness, by the way.
Right.
Because they see it day in and day out. I mean, they wouldn't articulate it in the way that I'm articulating, or we are articulating, because that sophistication is not needed for them, because they really see it on the ground, right? But the policy class needs to come to terms with it.
Sure.
Because the policy class, most of them post-independence, are from some privileged background or the other.
Sure.
Right? Either from a bureaucratic background or from an educated background from abroad. So for example, there's a good friend of mine who is probably in his 70s. He was mentioning to me that he did his PhD from an Ivy League school in 1972. In 1972, my grandmother was trying to find food for, probably through once a day, when they're literally in deep poverty, right? That is the contextual differences we're talking about, right? That most of the policymakers, especially pre-liberalization, were, sort of well-intentioned, quite a few of them, but their backgrounds were very different to what the people were.
Sure.
So in a post-reform society, the aspirational class is coming up more and more.
Right.
And the aspirational class is sort of taking center stage on a lot of these ideas. So policymakers, I feel, need to attune themselves to, and answering your question, I think the idea of sustainability is intrinsically there.
Right.
So it's about us, how do you take policy to sort of trigger that and make it into a movement in this transformation that Mudit was mentioning.
Okay, thank you. Komal, simple question to you. What does it take to create 100 more such organizations so that this sustainability and the sensitivity to that become environmental becomes an integral part of Brand Bharat?
So it's a very tough endeavor. Our sector is like a littered graveyard. There have been companies that are publicly listed in the US that have come to India and left. And, many people are questioning, what are we doing hanging on? We're here as Indians because we care. I come from a development economic research background, which is what introduced me to this area. And this may be the wrong thing to say in certain audiences, but there's different kinds of entrepreneurship. If entrepreneurship is driven by, I want something that in day one is investable and has this very clear roadmap, this is probably not the right track for you. There's another kind that says this is a problem. This is a solution that can happen. We need to achieve a certain scale and we need to build the market as we go along. But it takes, I think, that kind of crazy person to put their life into it, because we can't expect government subsidies, viability gap funding, all of that. But we're lucky that our market is huge. We're lucky that our market is open-minded. There's a consciousness that this is where the world is headed. I think we were discussing earlier. So this sector has largely flown under the radar of India somehow, but it is taking over the world. So even as recently as 2022, reports have started coming in that, for example, the US has reached the halfway tipping point. Over half of consumers in the US who shop for fashion each year shop pre-owned. People in India are shocked by this. It is unimaginable to so many of us, but it's beautiful to see the kind of demographic diversity that we see on both the demand and supply side. People from villages selling their old saris, people in luxury high rises in Mumbai buying them. It is a beautiful thing. So what would it take? I think uh, everything that encourages an entrepreneur. We've spoken a lot in this conference. A lot of people have spoken about regulatory malaise, cholesterol in the regulatory system. And even at our relatively small scale, it is something that we bump into far too often. We know that there's a lot of leadership on the top that is working very hard to clear this. But until that is prioritized, in a sector that is already so difficult to manage the logistics and the unit economics of, if that is not cleared, it will kill a lot of such industries in their track.
And maybe what to go back to what Ashish said, maybe this is one of the things that you might export. But on that one, I think I will take one question from the audience since I promised. Is it? Yeah, this one there.
Hi, my name is Dr. Subhi Chaturvedi. I lead global public policy for India's first unicorn. For the longest time, taught at Delhi University, Law, Media and Society. My questions to you, Ashish. If you were India's chief people officer, you spoke about ease of doing business, labor-intensive economies. The second fundamental pillar of convergence, as we see, is human talent and talent development. What would be your top 3 priorities? Because we need more of Ashish's, so to speak, for building brand Bharat. You're a builder of institutions and you get wartime, peacetime CEOs, you get people with transferable skills. We don't see that either from the demand side or from the supply side happening enough. Over to you. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think on the human capital side, I think there are 2, 3 key areas. One is early childhood development. We know it's so important. It's a stage where the brain is being developed, and it goes in hand with malnourishment, proper nourishment, care, etc. Foundational literacy and numeracy. We know that in India today, 55% of the children by class 5 can't read third grade text. We can't build a just and equal society, give people opportunities, unless in the early years we give them the foundational skills to succeed. And then finally, the bookends, which is more preparing people for life, the apprenticeships, the internships, relevant skilling. I still believe demand is more important than supply. Supply responds to demand. It's my sense. So the relevant training for the workforce is the third area that I would pick. Thank you.
Great. Okay, one more since he's already stood up and has the mic in hand.
So always be ready, sir. My name is Dr. Abhishek Puri. I'm a radiation oncologist from Mali. My question is to Mr. Budit. I also dabble in a little bit of AI. So you describe the industrial revolution as a real revolution where heads were being chopped off and a lot of blood was flowing in the streets. How do you see the AI? I want to know the economist's perspective. How do you see the AI impacting our society? Because we are neither industrialized nor we are technologically there. So I'm not an optimist, but I'm not a pessimist either.
No, don't get me wrong. I am an eternal optimist, because my definition of optimism is things could be much worse. We're sitting here, it's a good sign. Having said that, you see, when computers came, a question was asked to the economists in the 1980s. I see computers everywhere, but I don't see it in productivity. I think it's too early to talk about AI and its impact on average productivity. You will be surprised to know, at least in the Western world, the Industrial Revolution 3.0, which is for the first time, primarily European countries, this is after a gap of almost 120 years, that the average productivity growth is less than 1%. This is, in the modern times, it has not happened. So I think it's too early to talk about the impact of AI on the average productivity. A lot of people are talking about, that it's a threat to the economy, threat to the labor. To be very honest, it's too early to say anything on how it's going to transform the way people use the technology to become more productive. I mean, I used AI today to write a paper. It makes me more productive. So should I say Chat GPT is bad? No, it summarizes, the article for me in the most interesting way I could think of, right? So I think it's too early. We should not be pessimistic for sure, because I do trust that society has tremendous capacity to transform. But the cost is that, unfortunately, anything modern that comes, even what Ashish is trying to unleash in terms of education, you will be really surprised to know the modern mass education, which started with everybody being able to read the Bible. The whole objective was to make the laity out of the common people. The initial cost of it was very violent, because you can imagine, when I become more educated than my father, should I respect his authority? Does he have anything interesting to tell me? He has been respecting his father, right? I mean, so it's too early to tell, but I can assure you one thing, that society also has tremendous way to transform itself. Sometimes there is an expense, there is a cost associated with it, but I am confident that in India, the political dexterity that we have seen, we will be able to manage this transformation as well in the most constructive way. I mean, if this political, you see, the other day I was reading a letter which Nehru wrote. Nehru said that the bigger threat to India than communism was Hindu nationalist movement. It's a letter, he wrote it. But it's the same political structure that has given us a prime minister who we might say at a certain level is the opposite of Nehru, but in certain way also has the same vision in terms of India, right? There is a contradiction over there. But it's the same political system that has given a nobody, literally a nobody, made him the prime minister with one of the largest mandate, not only in India, but across the world. Now, I might disagree whether this is correct or wrong. Whatever are my political inclinations is besides the point. But I have to respect that political mandate. When this happened, this transfer of power happened in the most peaceful manner. So if this can happen in India, where we are not even developed, questions of peaceful transfer of power are being raised in the developed world, right? If it can happen, then I think we are ready for AI and its transformation. I personally believe we have the political machinery to absorb the shocks that might come out of it, and the transition is going to be very smooth. So I'm optimistic about India. I just wanted to lay out the plans.
Thank you. And on that optimistic note, let's thank the panelists, and may I request you to give a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you for a wonderful conversation.
And of course, a big thank you to Lan as well for leading this discussion. Thank you all so much. I'd like to quickly felicitate all our panelists on stage. I'd like to welcome on stage P.B. Srinivasan, India's leading tax consultant, to felicitate Lakshminarayan K.R. Lan with a lovely token of our appreciation. Thank you, Mr. Srinivasan. I'd now like to call on stage Abhishek Gupta, the CFO of Mintra, to felicitate Ashish Dhawan. Abhishek? Here you are. Thank you, Abhishek. Please now join me in welcoming on stage Nitya Kadambi, the CFO at Comvault, to felicitate Komal Hiranandani. Nitya, there you go. Thank you, Nitya. Please now join me in welcoming on stage Rashmi Mayur, the CFO at Automation Anywhere, to felicitate Mudit Kapoor. Thanks, Rashmi. To felicitate Sriram Balasubramaniam, please join me in welcoming on stage Rajesh Prabhu, the CFO at Sirocco. Thank you, Rajesh. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us here at the 8th edition of the India Ideas Conclave. I'd like to believe we are keeping reasonably good time. We will now break for refreshments. I'd welcome you all to join us for tea and coffee. And let me remind you that we will be joined live by our Minister of External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, at 6:30 p.m. So I request you all to join us back here by 6:25 and take your seats for this live engagement. Once again, at 6:30, Minister of External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, will be addressing us here at the 8th India Ideas Conclave. A small reminder to request you to join us back here by 6:25 and take your seat for our live engagement with Dr. Jaishankar. Once again, please join us for refreshments, for tea and coffee outside of this venue.
यस सर, ये आपका जो म्यूजिक प्ले हो रहा है वो आपका उसकी म्यूजिक की जो वॉइस है वो ब्रेक हो रही है।